She hit him first. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not his men, not the witnesses frozen around that conference table, not the journalists who would later write careful, vague things about tensions within Seoul's elite business circles. Han Taijin walked into that room, looked at the woman he had spent 3 years hunting across 4 countries, and he slapped her, open-handed, hard enough to turn her head, hard enough to make the sound echo off the glass walls. Nia Brooks didn't fall. She didn't cry. She pressed 2 fingers to her cheekbone, felt the heat rising there, and looked at him the way you look at something broken on the floor, something that used to matter and doesn't anymore. Every person in that room stopped breathing, and then Cha Do-hyun, the man they all feared more than death itself, stood up from his chair. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a woman finally stops running, this is that story. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part to the end, because this one is going to shake you. Hit like, drop a comment with the city and country where you're watching. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. 1. The morning Nia Brooks walked into Cha Do-hyun's office. She was wearing a navy blazer she'd bought secondhand from a consignment shop in Itaewon, and she had rehearsed her name 11 times on the subway ride over. Not because she'd forgotten it, because it still wasn't entirely hers. 3 years of being someone else does that to a person. You practice the small things, the name, the backstory, the way you shake hands and look people in the eye without flinching. Because the day you stop practicing is the day the cracks show. And cracks, in Nia's experience, were the kind of thing that got you found. She'd chosen Seoul for reasons that made sense at the time. Far enough, complicated enough. A city that swallowed foreigners whole and asked very few questions. She'd built a quiet life, taken translation contracts, kept her head down. It had almost been working. Then the agency called. Executive assistant position, private employer, significant compensation, unusual requirements. The recruiter had used that word, unusual, twice, which told Nia everything she needed to know about how bad the job actually was. But the address they sent her was on the 62nd floor of a building she'd walked past every week for months. And the salary they named was the kind of number that meant she could stop looking over her shoulder for a while. So she rehearsed her name on the subway. She straightened her secondhand blazer in the elevator mirror. And when the doors opened into Cha Do-hyun's reception area, all dark stone and low light, and the kind of silence that has weight to it, she walked in like she'd been there 100 times. The woman at the front desk looked at her the way people often looked at Nia in Seoul. A half second of recalibration, then professional neutrality snapping back into place. "Miss Brooks? That's me? He's ready for you?" He was not, in any visible sense, ready for her. Cha Do-hyun was standing with his back to the door when she entered, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a clipped, flat Korean that she caught maybe 60% of. Enough to understand he was ending something, not starting it. His shoulders were set like a man who hadn't fully unclenched in years. The office was large and spare, the kind of space that communicates power by refusing to explain itself. He turned around. Nia had done her research. She knew what he was, broadly speaking, the kind of man Seoul's business press referred to obliquely, with careful euphemism, the kind of man whose name appeared in financial reports but never in police records, because his lawyers were better than anyone the prosecutors could afford. She knew he was 38, that he'd inherited control of the Cha organization from a father nobody talked about, that 3 of his last 4 executive assistants had resigned within a month. She had not been prepared for the way he looked at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, with assessment, with appetite. This was different. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door they've been warned not to open, and they're trying to decide if the warning was real. "You're the one from the agency," he said in English. His accent was there but controlled, like most things about him. "Nia Brooks." She extended her hand. "I've read the full position description, including the supplemental requirements. I have questions." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. He looked at her hand for a beat longer than was comfortable, then shook it. His grip was firm without performing firmness. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand for now. It's easier to leave if this goes badly." The silence that followed was the kind that could have become dangerous. Instead, Do-hyun sat down himself, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, looked at someone who hadn't flinched. "The supplemental requirements," he said. "Which part concerns you?" "The engagement." He nodded, like this was expected. It's a business arrangement. There are 3 major negotiations over the next 6 months. International partners, a regional infrastructure deal, 2 acquisition conversations. My personal reputation affects those negotiations. Specifically, the perception that I am unstable, Naya said. His jaw tightened. I read the business press, she said. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm trying to understand what you actually need versus what the job description says you need. You want someone who can sit across from your business partners and make them believe you're a man with something to lose outside of money. That's one way to describe it. It's accurate. Is there a better way? He studied her for a long moment. You're not Korean. Correct. You relocated here 3 years ago. No business connections, no family. Your references are all international contracts, most of them done remotely. Nobody seems to know very much about you. He said it without inflection, without threat, almost like he was reading a weather report. Nia kept her face exactly where it was. I like it that way. Why? The same reason you keep your personal life out of the business press, I'd imagine. He looked at her differently after that. Not softer exactly, something more like recognition. The salary and the posting, she said, the real one, not the public listing. That number includes the engagement component? It includes everything. I'll need it in writing, all of it, including the boundaries of what the engagement does and doesn't require. That's already prepared. Then I have one more question. She met his eyes without blinking. The last 3 assistants, what actually happened to them? The question landed in the room and sat there. Do-hyun didn't look away. 2 couldn't handle the pressure of the position. 1 became personally involved in a way that complicated things. Personally involved with you? Yes. Nia nodded slowly. That won't be a problem. Everyone says that. I'm sure they do. She picked up her bag. I'll review the contract tonight. If the terms are what you've indicated, I'll return tomorrow. She made it to the door before he spoke again. Ms. Brooks? She stopped but didn't turn around. You're not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation with an edge on it, like he wasn't sure what to do with it. I'm afraid of plenty of things, she said. You're just not one of them right now. She left. And Do-hyun stood in his empty office for almost 3 full minutes before he called his assistant and told her to prepare the contract. The contract was what it claimed to be. Nia returned the next morning, signed it, and started work that afternoon. The first 2 weeks were almost entirely about the business. She was good at the work, better than good. She read faster than anyone on his team, understood financial structures that his own legal department sometimes fumbled over, and had a way of sitting in a room full of hostile men and making them feel, somehow, like she'd already anticipated every argument they were planning to make. Do-hyun's staff did not know what to make of her. His head of security, a compact man named Shin who had served the organization for 11 years and was loyal in the way only truly dangerous people are loyal, watched her from a professional distance and said nothing for the first week. By the second week, he had started placing a coffee on her desk in the morning without being asked. Nia noticed but didn't mention it. Small signals like that mattered in environments like this one. They told you who had decided you were worth the effort. The engagement arrangement began at a dinner in the 3rd week. Do-hyun had briefed her the day before. The Yoon Group's senior partners, a real estate acquisition that required their consortium's backing, a dinner at a private club in Gangnam. They needed to believe he was settled, grounded, that the stories about his volatility were exaggeration. What stories specifically? Nia asked. He had looked at her from across the desk without answering. It would help me to know, she said, what exactly we're trying to counter-program. That I end negotiations violently when they don't go my way. Do you? Less than the stories suggest. She had written a note on her legal pad, which she privately found satisfying. Okay, I'll handle the dinner. She handled the dinner. She wore a dress she'd borrowed from nobody because she owned exactly one dress appropriate for that level of venue, sat at Do-hyun's right hand, and spent 3 hours being precisely what the Yoon Group needed to see. A woman who looked at Cha Do-hyun like he was worth looking at, who touched his arm at exactly the right moment when one of the partners made a clumsy attempt to destabilize the conversation, who laughed at the right things and asked intelligent questions about the infrastructure proposal. At 10:47 p.m., the senior partner, a man named Yoon Byung-chul, who had been skeptical for the first half of the evening, leaned across the table and said to Do-hyun, "She's remarkable." Do-hyun said, I know. And the way he said it, flat and certain and without looking at Nia, made the senior partner nod slowly, like something had been confirmed. On the ride back, in the private car with the privacy screen up and the city streaming past outside, Nia took off her heels and put them on the seat beside her and looked out the window. The deal will close, she said. Yes. A pause. You told him his son's proposal had structural merit. It does. The rest of my team said it was risky. It is also risky. Both things are true. He needed someone to see the merit first and the risk second, in that order. She turned from the window. You would have done it the other way. Do-hyun said nothing for a moment. Yes. I know. She turned back to the window. That's why you hired me. The car moved through the city. Outside, Seoul was lit up and indifferent and enormous, and Nia looked at it and thought about what it cost her to sit in that restaurant and look at a man like she trusted him. She was better at performing trust than she used to be. That was not something she was proud of. The incident with Jeon Soo-yeon happened on a Thursday. Nia had known it was coming in the vague way you sense a storm before the sky changes. Small things, accumulated. The woman had appeared twice in the margins of the organization's social orbit, always at the right distance to be noticed, but not close enough to require acknowledgement. An ex, the staff had conveyed without saying the word directly. Someone who had not processed the end of things. The confrontation happened at a charity event in Cheongdam-dong. Do-hyun was across the room when Jeon Soo-yeon materialized at Nia's elbow, dressed with the particular aggression of a woman who has decided she's done being subtle. You're the assistant, she said in Korean. Nia answered in Korean. Executive assistant, and you're… Don't. The word was quiet and vicious. Don't pretend you don't know exactly who I am. He told you about me. He mentioned a name, Nia said, because it was true. Soo-yeon looked at her the way people sometimes looked at Nia when they'd decided she didn't belong. Not with curiosity, with inventory. How long do you think this lasts? He doesn't keep people. He never has. Whatever he's told you, whatever this is, she gestured between them, between the performance of the evening. You're temporary. Nia looked at her with an expression that could have been sympathy if you were feeling generous. Okay. Okay? The word scraped. That's all you… Is there something you actually need, Nia asked? Or are you just trying to feel something? The slap came fast. Too fast for Nia to step back, and she wouldn't have anyway. It caught her across the left cheek, open-handed, loud enough that the three people nearest them went still. Nia stood there for one full breath, felt the sting, felt the heat, felt the old familiar pull toward smallness. The instinct that had kept her alive for years by telling her to get small, get invisible, get gone. She did not get small. She slapped Soo-yeon back. Twice. The second one before the first had finished landing, not hard enough to hurt her badly, precisely hard enough to be undeniable. Soo-yeon's hand flew to her face. Her eyes went wide, then flooded. Not with pain, with shock. Nobody had ever… She was used to being the one who… Nia straightened her dress, checked her earring, and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't look for Do-hyun. She walked to the bar, ordered a glass of water, and drank half of it before she noticed her hand was trembling slightly. And that was the part that made her quietly furious with herself. Not the slap, not the confrontation, just the 2 seconds of adrenaline she couldn't stop. Do-hyun appeared beside her 11 seconds later. She counted. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood there and looked at the side of her face where the redness was still visible, and she expected him to apologize for the situation, for the woman, for the scene, because that was what men in his position did. They apologized for things they hadn't caused in a way that made themselves the center of the story. He didn't apologize. What he said was, "You slapped her twice." She started it. I know. Another pause. Nobody's ever done that. Nia set her glass down. I find that hard to believe. I mean, nobody's ever… He stopped, rearranged something in his expression. She did that to every woman I've ever been seen with. Every one of them left that night. Nia looked at him for a moment. She said, and nothing else. She went back to working the room, because there was still work to be done, and because standing there while he looked at her like that, like she was something he hadn't encountered before and wasn't sure how to categorize, made her feel something she had no business feeling in the middle of a job. She had spent 3 years learning the difference between a feeling and a signal. This felt like both, which was exactly the problem. 3 hours later, in another private car heading back through the lit-up city, Do-hyun looked at her in the dark and said quietly and without preparation, "I have never admired someone so quickly." Nia kept looking out the window. "That's our problem," she said. "I know." "Then let's leave it there." She felt him look at her for a long moment before he turned away. Outside, the city kept going, enormous and indifferent and lit up like it had no idea what had just started. The city didn't sleep, and neither did Nia. She was at her desk by 6:15 the next morning, before anyone else arrived, before the cleaning staff finished the hallways, before the coffee machine in the executive kitchen had fully cycled through its warm-up sequence. She had a spreadsheet open on one monitor and a legal contract on the second, and she was working through both with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that stillness was dangerous. The moment you stopped moving was the moment your mind went somewhere you hadn't given it permission to go. Last night's car ride kept surfacing anyway. The way Do-hyun had said it, "I have never admired someone so quickly." Not with the rehearsed smoothness of a man who knew how to make women feel wanted, but with something underneath it that sounded almost like frustration. Like he hadn't meant to say it and was annoyed that he had. She filed it. That was the system. You took the thing that could compromise you, you acknowledged it existed, and you filed it somewhere you didn't have to look at often. She had built that system over 3 years of surviving, and it had worked well enough. She turned back to the contract. By 7:30, Shin was in the building. She heard him before she saw him, the particular cadence of his walk, unhurried but never wandering. He appeared in her doorway, looked at the two monitors and the empty coffee cup, and disappeared without a word. 4 minutes later, a full cup appeared on the edge of her desk. She didn't thank him out loud. She moved it 6 inches to a better position where she could reach it without looking, which in the language of that office meant the same thing. By 9, the floor was populated. By 9:20, the first problem of the day had arrived. His name was Park Jun-ho, and he was Do-hyun's chief financial officer, and he had the particular energy of a man who had been very comfortable before someone rearranged the furniture. He was 44, 10 years into the organization, and he had an office 3 doors down from Do-hyun's that he treated like a throne room. In the 6 weeks since Nia had started, he had been professionally courteous in the way that is almost indistinguishable from contempt. The 2 slow explanations, the documents sent to her email chain 5 minutes after the meeting they were relevant to, the habit of addressing questions about her work to Do-hyun instead of to her. That morning he walked into her office without knocking, which she clocked and chose not to address immediately, and placed a manila folder on her desk with the specific energy of someone who expects the action to conclude a conversation before it starts. "The Daegu account projections," he said. Do-hyun asked for them by end of week. "They're done." Nia looked at the folder without touching it. "He asked for them by Wednesday." He said end of week. "I was in the room when he said it. Wednesday, close of business." A pause. Not long, but dense. "The modeling takes time. The methodology we use for infrastructure. I know the methodology." She picked up the folder, opened it, turned 3 pages. "You're using a 5-year depreciation curve on assets that have a 7-year operational cycle. That's going to undervalue the return in years 4 and 5 by about 12%. Junho looked at her. The look had several layers to it, and the one on top was professional disagreement, and underneath that was something older and less professional. "That's the standard model we've used for 3 years, he said. "I know." She closed the folder and held it out to him. "Which is why the Incheon numbers came in low last fiscal year, and everyone decided to blame market conditions. The model is wrong. Fix the depreciation curve and rerun it. I need it by tomorrow noon." He didn't take the folder. "This goes through Do-hyun." "Does it?" She set it on the desk between them and looked at him directly. "When he gave me oversight of the financial review process last month, did he walk you through what that meant?" "He gave you oversight of the review process, not the modeling methodology." "The modeling methodology is what determines whether the review is accurate." She picked up her coffee. "Tomorrow noon, Junho. I'll be here." He picked up the folder. He left. He did not say anything else, which told her the argument wasn't over. It was just being relocated to a venue he chose. She was right about that. By 11 o'clock, Do-hyun's calendar had acquired a 30-minute slot labeled Internal Finance Discussion, requested by Park Jun-ho, scheduled without going through Nia's coordination process. She looked at the calendar notification, calculated the angle, and went back to her work. At 11:55, Do-hyun appeared in her doorway. He looked the way he usually looked in the mornings, controlled, dressed in that particular shade of charcoal that he seemed to own in multiples, with something behind his eyes that was always operating at a frequency slightly below the surface of whatever conversation he was having. In the weeks she'd worked for him, she had learned to read that frequency the way you learn to read weather, not perfectly, but well enough to prepare. Right now it read as, "Someone has brought me something I didn't ask for." "Junho says you rejected his projections," Do-hyun said. "I sent them back for corrections." She pulled up the relevant spreadsheet on her monitor and turned it to face him. "He's using the wrong depreciation curve. It's the same error that produced the Incheon variance. I flagged it." Do-hyun studied the screen for a moment. He didn't sit down. He had a way of occupying doorways that made them look like deliberate choices. "He's been doing financial modeling for this organization for a decade," he said. "I know. He doesn't accept criticism easily. I know that too." She met his eyes. "Are you asking me to soften it?" A pause. "I'm telling you the operational reality. The operational reality is that the Daegu deal is worth approximately 40 million in the first phase, and his model is going to undervalue it by close to 5 million. Softening my feedback doesn't change the number." She held his gaze. "If you want me to manage him more carefully, I can do that. But the projection still needs to be corrected." Do-hyun was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Then, "He's going to make your life difficult." "He's already been making my life difficult. I don't need the warning. I need to know if you're going to back the call." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite irritation. "Fix the projection," he said. "I'll handle Jun-ho." He left. She turned back to her screen and let out a breath that was smaller and quieter than the one she'd been holding. She hadn't been certain which way that was going to go. Do-hyun did not, as it turned out, handle Jun-ho in any visible way. What happened instead was more precise. The meeting that Jun-ho had requested disappeared from the calendar, replaced by a different meeting that Jun-ho was also required to attend and that covered unrelated operational matters for 90 minutes. By the time it ended, the window for a private conversation had closed. It was the kind of move Nia recognized. Not a confrontation, a redirection. She filed it under. He operates through control of environment rather than direct conflict. That was useful to know. The corrected projections arrived the next morning at 11:48. The depreciation curve had been adjusted. The numbers told a more accurate story. Nia sent a one-line reply thanking Jun-ho for the quick turnaround, which she knew would irritate him precisely because it left him nowhere to put his frustration. She was not proud of knowing that, but she wasn't sorry about it either. The week continued. 3 client meetings, 2 of which she attended as Do-hyun's partner in the public-facing sense, a lunch and a gallery opening that one of the acquisition targets was sponsoring. She wore the navy blazer to the lunch and a different dress she'd found for the opening, a dark green thing that she'd almost returned twice before deciding it looked like someone who knew where she was going. At the gallery opening, a man she didn't know stopped her near a sculpture of hammered steel and said, in accented English, "You must be the famous Ms. Brooks." She looked at him. He was mid-50s, broadly built, with a smile that had too many teeth in it and the specific ease of someone who had never seriously feared consequences. "Depends on who's calling me famous," she said. "Lee Dong-wook." He extended a hand. "Old associate of Do-hyun's. Very old." The way he said very old did a lot of work. "I've been hearing about you for weeks, the woman who actually stays." "I work for him," she said. "That's a different thing from staying." "Is it?" His smile was still there, but his eyes were doing something his smile wasn't. In our world, the two tend to look the same from a distance. Do-hyun materialized at her left shoulder so quietly that Lee Dong-wook's smile flickered for just a half-second before it restabilized. "Dong-wook," Do-hyun said. His voice was the same as always, flat, even, but the air around him had changed. "Do-hyun, your assistant is impressive." He said the word assistant the way you'd say it with quotation marks around it without actually using them. "We were getting acquainted." "I see that." Do-hyun's hand appeared at the small of Nia's back. Light, brief, but present. Excuse us. He guided her away with exactly enough pressure to communicate direction without communicating urgency. When they were 10 feet clear, she said quietly, "Who is he?" "Someone who collects information about other people's weaknesses and sells it when the price is right." A pause. "He's been on the periphery of 3 organizations in 15 years. None of them survived the association. And you let him come tonight? He was on the guest list before I saw it." She glanced back once. Lee Dong-wook was watching them go with that same smile, patient in the way predators are patient. "He was looking for something," she said. "Yes." "Did he find it?" Do-hyun looked at her for a moment before answering. "That depends on what he was looking for." She turned that over in her mind for the rest of the evening and didn't arrive at an answer she liked.
이죠?
3 days later, Junho made his real move. It didn't come at her directly. That wasn't his style, she'd learned. It came sideways through a meeting she hadn't been included in, with 2 of the organization's regional managers and a restructured budget proposal that quietly removed her oversight function from the financial review process and reclassified it as an advisory role. She found out from Shin, who left a printed copy of the meeting summary on the corner of her desk with no explanation attached. She read it twice, then put it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent Do-hyun a message. "I need 15 minutes, not a request." He responded in 40 seconds. "Now." She walked into his office without the folder and without notes, which was a choice. He was standing at his window. He did that when he was processing something, she'd noticed. Used the city view the way other people used pacing. She told him what had happened, not with anger, not with performance, just the facts and what they meant. He listened without interrupting, which he was good at in a way that most men in his position weren't. When she finished, he said, "He went around you." He restructured the reporting lines without flagging it. "Yes." "Why are you telling me instead of reversing it yourself?" The question landed with intention. She looked at him. "Because if I reverse it without your explicit backing, he'll do it again in a month with slightly better paperwork. This only stops if it stops from above. And if I back you, he resigns." "Maybe." She held his gaze. "Is that a problem?" Do-hyun turned from the window. He crossed to his desk, sat down, and looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than his usual register. Not the controlled blankness, something more active. "You understand," he said slowly, "that you're asking me to choose." "Yes." "Between someone who has been loyal for a decade and someone who has been here for 6 weeks. I'm asking you to choose between accurate financial information and comfortable financial information." She didn't look away. "But if you want to frame it personally, yes, that's the choice." The silence in the room had texture. Outside, the city moved and was indifferent. "Junho will be in a new position by end of month," Do-hyun said finally. "Regional oversight. Far enough from the core financials to limit the damage he can do. He won't resign. He needs the organization more than he admits." He looked at her steadily. "Your oversight of the review process stands, in writing, this time." Nia let the information settle. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. He's going to find other ways to make things difficult. This isn't finished." "I know." She picked up her bag. "It never really is." She made it 3 steps toward the door. "Nia." She stopped. He hadn't used her first name before. It was a small thing, and it registered like a bell struck in a quiet room. "The man at the gallery," Do-hyun said. "Lee Dong-wook. He called me this morning." She turned slowly. "And?" "He wanted to know if our engagement was real." Do-hyun's voice was still even, but there was something underneath it, a tightening she could hear if she listened for it. "He said he'd recently received some information about you, from out of the country. He offered to share it with me for a price." The room was very still. Nita kept her face exactly where it was. She had practiced this for years. The way you absorb a blow to your center and don't let it reach your face. But her body knew. Her body always knew. There was a shift in her breathing, small and involuntary, and she hated that it happened. "What did you tell him?" she said. Her voice was level. "I told him I wasn't interested in secondhand information about my own fiancé." A pause. "And that if he contacted me about this matter again, I would consider it an act of provocation. She looked at him. He looked back. Is there something I should know? He asked. Not with accusation, with the particular quiet of a man who has learned that the most important questions come in simple packaging. The window was there. She could see it, the moment where she could give him something small and true, something that deflected without revealing, something she'd used a dozen times in the past 3 years when someone got too close to the real edges. Instead, she heard herself say, yes. The word sat between them like something fragile. Not now, she added. Her voice had a catch in it she didn't want. Not standing in the middle of your office. But yes, there's something you should know. Do-hyun looked at her for a long moment. His expression had changed. The operational surface of it had gone somewhere else, and what was underneath was something that looked improbably like patience. Tonight, he said. The car. Same as before. She nodded. She left. She spent the rest of the afternoon working at a pace that was almost punishing. Contract review. 3 calls. A supplier negotiation that she handled in 40 minutes when the estimate had been 90. She was efficient the way certain people are efficient when they are doing everything possible not to think. Not about the car ride. Not about what she was going to say. Not about the 18-month gap in her history that Lee Dong-wook had apparently found the edge of. Shin watched her from the doorway at 4:30 with the specific expression of a man who has seen enough to know when something is wrong and has enough sense not to say so. At 6, when the floor had mostly cleared, she went to the restroom and stood in front of the mirror for 2 minutes. She didn't do anything in particular, didn't adjust her hair, didn't check her makeup. She just stood there and looked at herself and did the things she'd learned to do when the ground shifted. She found the version of herself that was still standing, and she stayed with that until it felt like enough. It felt like enough. The car was at the curb at 7. The privacy screen was already up when she got in. Do-hyun was there, jacket off for once, which she'd never seen. It made him look more human in a way that was unhelpful. He didn't start the conversation. He let the city take a few minutes. She looked out the window and organized herself. 3 years ago, she said. Nairobi. I was working international financial compliance, legitimate work, contracts and audits for regional infrastructure projects. That's how I met Han Tae-jin. Do-hyun went still beside her. He ran import operations through 3 countries. The compliance work I was doing overlapped with his networks, and he was careful about it. He always made sure the legitimate surface was solid. By the time I understood what I was actually adjacent to, I was... She stopped, chose the next word carefully. In. In, Do-hyun repeated. We were engaged. That's the word I'd use now. At the time, it felt like something else. She watched the lights move outside. He doesn't see people. Not really. He sees assets and liabilities. I spent 8 months thinking I was an asset, and then one conversation, one specific night, I understood I was a liability in waiting, that the moment I became inconvenient, the calculation would change. What happened that night? Do-hyun's voice was very quiet. I found his files. She said it plainly, like it was old information, which it was. I wasn't looking. I was working late at his offices, and his primary systems were open, and I understood within about 45 seconds what I was looking at. Every transaction, every front company, every government official he had in his pocket across 6 countries. She turned from the window and looked at the dark interior of the car. I copied everything, every encrypted file. I had 20 minutes before his security did their sweep, and I used all 20 of them. The car moved through an intersection. Seoul kept going outside. He would have killed you, Do-hyun said. Not a question. If he knew I had them? Yes. If I stayed? Eventually. Either way. She looked at her hands. So I left. I had 72 hours before he noticed the gaps in my access log, and I used them. New documents, new name, new country. I left Nairobi, then Johannesburg, then Brussels, then here. She paused. The files are what keep me alive. He knows I have them. He knows if anything happens to me, they surface. That's the arrangement, except nobody ever agreed to it out loud. The quiet in the car was different from before, denser. How long has he been looking? Do-hyun asked. Continuously. He's found me twice in 3 years. Both times I was gone before his people were in position. She said it without pride because there was none. It was logistics. It was survival arithmetic. Lee Dong-wook didn't find out where I am. He found out who I was before. That's a different problem. Do-hyun turned and looked at her fully. In the low light of the car, with the city moving past the windows, his face had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not the operational surface, not the controlled distance. Something underneath all of that. Something that was paying attention in the way that cost something. The files, he said. Where are they? Safe. If he locates you here, I have a protocol, she said. I've always had a protocol. A protocol. He said the word with a specific weight that was not quite anger and not quite something else. You have a plan to disappear again. She looked at him. Yes. He looked back. The city passed outside, indifferent and lit and enormous. And somewhere in the quality of that silence, in the way he was looking at her like he was working through something that had no clean answer, Nia felt the ground beneath her shift again. Not the familiar shift of danger, but something else. Something that felt, before she could stop it from feeling like anything, like the beginning of not being alone. She looked away first. Now you know, she said. If that changes the arrangement, it doesn't. His voice was quiet and definite in the way certain things are definite when there's no performance attached to them. Do-hyun, it doesn't change the arrangement. A pause that had weight in it. But I'm going to need you to tell me everything. Not tonight, but everything. He turned back to the window. Because Lee Dong-wook is not the last person who is going to come looking, and I would rather know exactly what I'm dealing with before they arrive. She understood what he was saying under what he was saying. He was not letting her disappear. That was either the most dangerous thing she'd heard in 3 years, or the first safe thing. She hadn't figured out which yet when the car stopped in front of her building, and she got out, and she went upstairs, and she sat in her apartment for a long time in the dark without turning on a light, working out the difference between those two things and coming up, again and again, completely empty. Outside the window, Seoul was still going. Somewhere in this city, someone was already looking for her. And somewhere behind her now, in a way she hadn't planned for and couldn't entirely explain, was the one person who had said he'd rather know. That was the part that kept her awake until 3 in the morning. Not the danger. She knew how to sleep through danger. It was the other thing she didn't know what to do with. She gave herself until Monday. That was the deal she made with herself in the dark of her apartment, sitting on the floor with her back against the couch, because the couch felt too comfortable for the kind of thinking she was doing. Until Monday, she would not make any decisions about what Do-hyun's words meant, what Lee Dong-wook's call meant, what any of it meant. Until Monday, she would just work. She was good at working. Working had kept her sane through worse than this. Saturday passed. She reviewed contracts, reorganized the filing structure on the Daegu deal, and ate rice she cooked badly because she'd never learned to cook rice well and had never cared enough to fix that. She did not think about the car ride. She did not think about the way Do-hyun had said it doesn't change the arrangement with the particular flatness of someone stating a fact they've already decided. Sunday passed. She ran 4 kilometers along the Han River in the early morning when the path was still mostly empty, and she thought about nothing except her feet and the water and the cold in her lungs, which was exactly what running was for. Monday arrived and the decision got made for her. She was at her desk by 7, same as always, and the message was already there when she opened her work system, flagged urgent, which meant it had come through the organization's internal security channel rather than normal email. She read it twice. Then she put her coffee down very carefully and read it a 3rd time, because the 3rd time was when the full weight of it arrived. Lee Dong-wook was dead. Found in his car in a parking structure in Mapogu, early Sunday morning. The details were preliminary, but the organization's security contacts inside the police department had already confirmed, not an accident, not a health event. Someone had gone to the effort of making it look like both, which meant someone with resources and patience had decided he was finished. Nia sat with that information for 90 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Do-hyun. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he already knew. "You saw it," she said, 20 minutes ago. "Did you—" She stopped, reframed. "Was this your organization?" A pause. It was 3 seconds long, which in Do-hyun's vocabulary of silences meant, "I'm deciding how much truth to give you." "No," he said. It wasn't. She believed him. She wasn't sure why she believed him, but she did, and she'd long since learned to trust her own calibration on that particular question. She had too much writing on it to get it wrong. Then someone else found out he had information about me, she said. Yes. Which means Taejin's network is closer than I thought. Come in, Do-hyun said. Not the main office. The secondary location. Shin will send you the address. She was already standing. I'll be there in 30 minutes. 25, he said, and ended the call. She moved through her apartment with the efficiency of someone who had packed in a hurry before and knew which things mattered. Documents, drives, the small encrypted device she kept taped behind the bathroom mirror set. She had it in her bag in 4 minutes. She was out the door in 6. In the elevator, she looked at herself in the mirror again. Same as Friday. Same face, same blazer. Same eyes that had been looking back at her for 31 years. She thought about the protocol, the plan she'd told Do-hyun she had, the one that involved a bag and a locker at Suseo Station and a contact number in Osaka and a sequence of moves she'd rehearsed enough times that they were muscle memory. She thought about it. And then the elevator opened, and she walked out into the morning, and she went toward the address Shin had sent instead of toward Suseo Station, and she noted that choice without entirely understanding it yet. The secondary location was a floor of a building in Uedo that looked from the outside like a mid-tier financial consulting firm. Inside, it was something more operational, a working space with security-grade windows, encrypted communication infrastructure, and a staff of 6 people she'd never seen before who moved with the specific economy of people trained not to waste motion. Do-hyun was in a room off the main space with Shin and a man she didn't know. Early 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with reading glasses pushed up on his head that looked wrong next to everything else about him. She walked in. Do-hyun looked at her and then at her bag, which was fuller than a person carries to a Monday morning meeting. You packed, he said. Habit. She set the bag down and looked at the man with the glasses. Who is this? Kang, the man said. He had a voice like gravel under a door. I handle intelligence for the organization's external concerns. Intelligence, she repeated. He knows about the files, Do-hyun said. I told him Saturday, before Dong-wook. The information settled over her like cold water. She looked at Do-hyun steadily. You told him before you told me you were going to. I needed to understand what we were dealing with. We, she said, with an edge on it. Yes. He didn't move. We. That's where we are. She wanted to be angry about it, the decision made without her, the information shared without her consent. And she was, underneath. But the anger had nowhere practical to go right now, so she filed it and looked at Kang. What do you know? Kang opened a folder on the table. He didn't make her sit down, which she appreciated. Han Tae-jin's network has had a presence in Seoul for approximately 4 months. Not his core people, peripheral contractors, the kind he uses when he wants distance. The man who approached you outside, the one who delivered the ultimatum. She went still. What man? Kang looked up from the folder. Nia looked at Do-hyun. What ultimatum? What is he talking about? Do-hyun's jaw was set. He turned to Kang. You said this was confirmed. The surveillance log shows what surveillance log? Nia's voice was flat and careful, in the way her voice got when she was working very hard not to let it do something else. You've been surveilling me? The room had a specific quality of silence after that. Not you, Shin said from near the door. It was the first thing he'd said. The building. For 4 weeks. After the gallery event. She turned to look at him. Shin met her eyes without flinching, which she expected, and with something in his expression that was as close to apologetic as his face seemed able to get, which she hadn't. 4 weeks, she said. The threat level warranted. Do-hyun started. Don't. She cut him off. Not loudly, just cleanly. Don't explain it to me like I'm a resource you're protecting. You put surveillance on my building without telling me, without asking. After I told you in that car that I've spent 3 years surviving because I know when I'm being watched. She looked at him directly. Do you understand what that felt like? When the system is good enough that even I didn't notice it? Do-hyun looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. I understand what that felt like. I made a decision that I didn't have your consent for. We can have that conversation, but not before you tell me about the man who approached you. She pushed air through her teeth, turned to Kong. Show me the log. Kong turned the folder toward her. She looked at the surveillance image, grainy, timestamped from 9 days ago, outside the side entrance of her building. A man in a gray jacket, facing her, close enough that the conversation would have been private. She looked at it for a long moment. I know who that is, she said. Who? Do-hyun asked. His name is Reeves. He's American. Taejin hired him 3 years ago to handle Western-facing operations, mostly logistics, occasionally enforcement. She touched the edge of the photograph without picking it up. He found me 9 days ago. He said I had 1 week. The silence in the room changed quality. 1 week to what? Do-hyun said. His voice had gone very quiet, which she had learned was the register where he was most dangerous. Return to Nairobi, to Taejin. She looked up from the photograph. Or be taken by force. Do-hyun's expression didn't break, but something behind it did, briefly, and then locked back into place. And you didn't tell me. I was going to tell you. I was building toward it. 9 days, Nia. There was something in how he said her name, not hard, just pressed, like something with weight on it. You had 9 days and you didn't, because telling you meant this, she said. Exactly this. This room and these people and your surveillance footage and you making decisions about my safety that I didn't agree to. She held his gaze. Every time someone else has decided they were protecting me, I've ended up in more danger, not less. You understand that? The reason I'm still alive is because the only person who ever made decisions about my survival was me. The room held. Kong studied his folder with the focused attention of a man trying hard not to be in this conversation. Do-hyun crossed the room. He didn't rush it. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with something that was past the controlled surface entirely now. Something that was awake and present and entirely without performance. That changes now, he said quietly. She looked at him. You don't get to just... I'm not saying you hand it to me. I'm saying you don't carry it alone. There's a difference. A pause. Or there should be. She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. The fluorescent light above them hummed faintly. Outside, the Han River was gray and cold and going somewhere. 1 week was 9 days ago, she said finally. Yes. He turned back to the room. Which means we're already past the deadline. Kong cleared his throat. There's something else in the log. He turned another page. 3 days ago, there was a second approach. Different man. This one we identified. He's Korean, mid-level in the Taejin network. Name is Cho Sung-min. He didn't approach Ms. Brooks directly. He paused. He approached one of your junior staff, Mr. Cha, someone in the administrative pool. Do-hyun turned back. Which one? Yoo Min-jae. He's been with the organization 8 months. Kong closed the folder. Sung-min paid him to provide Miss Brooks's internal schedule, her meeting locations, her daily routing. Yoo Min-jae provided 2 weeks of schedule data before we identified the contact. The information hit the room and detonated slowly. Nia felt it go through her like temperature change. Not fast, but total. 2 weeks of her schedule. Every meeting, every location, every time she'd left the building and where she'd gone after. The charity event, the gallery, the client lunches. Every moment she'd thought was contained inside the organization's walls had been mapped and sold for whatever Cho Sung-min had offered a junior administrator with presumably not enough of whatever he wanted. She sat down. Not because she needed to, but because standing was suddenly requiring more maintenance than she wanted to spend on it. Where is Yoo Min-jae now? She said. Detained, Shin said. As of this morning. And Cho Sung-min? Gone, Kong said. He left the country Saturday. We think he went to Japan, which meant the information was already somewhere, already in motion, already in the hands of whoever Sung-min reported to, which meant it was in the hands of the structure that answered to Taejin, which meant the week's deadline was already irrelevant because the preparation for what came after a missed deadline was already underway. She looked at the table. There was a pen on it, a legal pad, a coffee ring from someone's cup. Very ordinary objects in a very ordinary room in which everything had just shifted. He knows exactly where I am, she said. Not for the room. just to say it out loud, because saying it out loud was how she'd always handled the worst things. You named them, you gave them their right size, and then you figured out what you could do within that size. Yes, Do-hyun said, and he knows my routine. When I'm in the building, when I'm not. Yes. Which means the next approach won't be a message. She looked up. He doesn't send the message twice. Do-hyun looked at her steadily. No, he won't send another message. She pressed her fingers against the table and looked at the pen and the coffee ring and thought about Taejin's face. The specific way he had looked at her in those last weeks before she ran, with the patient assessment of someone calculating an asset's remaining value. She thought about what it had cost her to copy those files. 20 minutes, a stolen access window, the sustained terror of a person doing the most important and most irreversible thing they've ever done. 3 years of running, funded by that one night's courage and that one encrypted drive. The files, she said. Kong. She looked at him. If those files surface, if I upload them to the right places, send them to the right investigators, how long before Taejin's operations are genuinely compromised? Kong considered this with the specificity of a man who had thought about it already. Depends on the content. 6 countries, 12 years, approximately 40 senior officials across 3 governments, and the complete financial architecture of 3 major front company networks. She said it evenly. How long? Kong's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. If the content is what you're describing, and it's properly authenticated and delivered to the right jurisdiction simultaneously, he took a breath. Weeks, maybe 10 days for the first wave of freezes. The political fallout would take longer, but the operational damage would be fast. Then that's the play, she said. It's also the play that puts the largest possible target on you immediately, Do-hyun said. The moment those files move, he has nothing left to protect. The only thing left for him is retaliation. I know. Nia, I know. She looked at him. But right now his reason to take me alive is that he wants the files destroyed quietly. The moment they're already out, that reason disappears. She held his gaze. Taking me becomes revenge instead of strategy. And Taejin is a strategist. He doesn't spend resources on revenge. The room considered this. Outside, traffic on the bridge moved without knowing anything about the conversation in this room. The river moved. The city moved. Seoul was indifferent to all of it, the way cities are. She's not wrong, Kong said, quietly, almost reluctantly. Do-hyun looked at Nia for a long time. And if you're wrong about him? If he decides the revenge matters more than the cost? She looked back without blinking. Then I was wrong. But I've been right about Taejin for 3 years. Longer than that. She paused. The question is whether you trust my read. I trust your read, he said immediately. No pause. No calculation. It hit her harder than she expected, and she managed not to show it, which cost her something. There's a condition, she said. What condition? The files don't move yet. Not until we know where Sung-min is, who else in this building has been compromised, and what Taejin's people are positioned to do in the next 72 hours. If we release them while his team is already in motion, we lose the window. She looked at Kong. Can you get me that assessment in 12 hours? Kong glanced at Do-hyun. Do-hyun nodded once. 12 hours, Kong said. Then that's where we start. She stood up fully. Her bag was still on the floor by the door. She didn't pick it up yet, which was its own kind of answer to the question neither of them had asked out loud. The 12 hours were the longest of the year. She stayed in the Yeouido location rather than going back to her apartment, which was a security decision that Do-hyun had made and which she had accepted without argument, not because she was deferring, but because arguing the point would have required energy she needed elsewhere. They gave her a room with a window, a cot, and a desk, and she worked through the afternoon on the files she had with her. Not the encrypted drives, but the structural analysis she'd built over 3 years of studying Taejin's network. The map she'd made in her head and on paper of how it all fit together, which entities fronted which operations, which officials were protected by which relationships. At some point, someone brought food. She ate about half of it. At some point, Do-hyun knocked and came in and sat in the one chair and said nothing for a while, which she had started to understand was not awkwardness, but the way he occupied space when he was thinking. He was going to marry you, he said eventually. Yes. And you didn't see it. What he was. I saw parts of it, she said. I chose to look at other parts. She didn't say this with self-pity, because she didn't feel any. She felt what she always felt about those 8 months. A clean, unadorned recognition of the choices she'd made and the costs of them. I was 28, and I thought being chosen by someone like him meant I was worth choosing. Do-hyun looked at her. You were worth choosing. That's not what it meant. She looked back at him. I know that now. He nodded. He looked at the window. My last relationship ended because she said I looked at her like a problem I was managing. Nia was quiet. She wasn't entirely wrong, he said. I didn't know how to... He stopped. His hands were on his knees and he looked at them. I kept waiting for her to show me where she was fragile so I could protect it, and she just wanted me to stop looking for it. Some people don't want to be managed, Nia said. I'm learning that. He glanced at her. Something crossed his face. Not a smile exactly. Something more aware than a smile. Slowly. They stayed like that for a while, the city going gray outside the window, the room holding the quiet between them. At 11:47, Kong knocked. His face told her before his words did. She sat up from the chair and felt the quality of what was coming the way you feel a temperature drop, in the air before it arrives. He put 3 photographs on the desk. She looked at them. The first was a surveillance image from the parking structure where Lee Dong-wook had been found. A figure, partially obscured, entering the structure at 2:14 a.m. The second was a street camera image from near her building. Same figure, different night, different angle. The third was an organizational chart printed from their internal system, with one name circled in red ink. She stared at the third photograph. The name circled was Park Jun-ho. The room did something to her vision for a moment. Not literally, but there was a quality to the next 3 seconds that was different from normal perception. The financial reports she'd corrected, the meeting he'd tried to restructure around her, the 10 years of loyalty to the organization. And underneath all of it, for how long? An arrangement with a network she'd carried inside her worst nightmares for 3 years. He's been in contact with Taejin's people since before I arrived, Kong said. We think the initial contact was 6 months ago. The assignment, finding out who Do-hyun had brought into his inner operation, that was the actual job. Ms. Brooks's arrival accelerated the timeline. She turned the organizational chart over so she didn't have to look at the name. He identified me, she said. Her voice was absolutely level. He provided the confirmation. Sungmin had a physical description. Junho confirmed the identity 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, she had been sending Junho's projections back with corrections. 3 weeks ago, he had been in contact with the man who had spent 3 years trying to return her to a life she had torn herself out of with her own hands. Do-hyun had gone very still beside her, the kind of still that was not stillness, but pressure. Where is he now? Do-hyun said. His voice was quiet in a way that was no longer a register she was going to interpret as simply dangerous. Still in the building, Kong said. He doesn't know we know. Do-hyun looked at Nia. She looked back at him. And that look was the thing neither of them needed to say out loud. The man who had been inside this organization for a decade, who had maneuvered around her from the first week, who had looked at her across a conference table and calculated her value to someone else. He was 3 floors below them right now. The files moved tonight, Nia said. Her voice had changed. Something in it had come to a point, like a pencil pressed hard enough to make the line permanent. We don't wait for the 72-hour assessment. Junho's cover being intact for even another 12 hours is a risk we can't carry. If we move the files tonight, Taejin's people will know within hours, Kong said. Yes, she said. That's why we moved Junho at the same time. She looked at Do-hyun. And that's why I need you to help me do something I've never asked anyone to help me do. Do-hyun looked at her without any performance in his face at all. Just attention, just the full and undivided weight of someone who had said we and meant it. Tell me, he said. She put her hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall behind him and began to explain what 3 years of surviving had taught her about the only way left to end this. While outside the window, the city held its enormous indifferent breath, and somewhere 3 floors below them, a man who had already sold her once was sitting at a desk, not yet knowing that the last calculation he would make inside this building had already been made for him. The plan had 4 parts and about 11 things that could go wrong with each of them. Nia laid it out on the desk in the Yoido room with Kong and Shin and Do Hyun standing around her like the walls of a room closing in a direction she'd chosen. And she went through it methodically, the way she'd learned to think about survival. Not with hope, not with fear, but with the cold precision of someone who has already accepted the worst outcome and is working backward from there. Part 1. Junho. He couldn't be moved clumsily. If Taejin's network registered a disruption in their inside contact before the files were uploaded, they'd accelerate whatever they had positioned in the city, and the window would collapse. The approach had to look like a routine late-night conversation, a financial discrepancy that needed resolution, the kind of thing that happened in organizations like this one. Shin would handle it. He'd done similar things before, which Nia didn't ask about and Shin didn't volunteer. Part 2. The files. She had 3 encrypted drives, one in her bag, one in the locker at Suseo Station, one in a location she hadn't told anyone about yet and wasn't sure she was ready to. The upload had to hit 6 destinations simultaneously, 2 investigative journalists she'd built contact with over 3 years, 1 international financial crimes unit, 1 regional prosecutor's office in Nairobi, and 2 regulatory bodies in Brussels, whose jurisdiction covered 3 of Taejin's front companies. Simultaneous. Staggered delivery would give his lawyers time to suppress. Part 3. Her own position. She would not be at the Yoido building when the files moved. She would be somewhere visible, trackable, even. Because the moment Taejin's people lost contact with Junho and saw the file uploads begin, their instinct would be to move on her immediately, and she needed to be somewhere Do Hyun's people could contain that move rather than chase it through the city. Part 4. Do Hyun himself. He would handle the message to Taejin directly, not through intermediaries, not through lawyers, directly, in the language that men like Taejin understood, the language of irrecoverable consequence. She finished laying it out and looked up. The room was quiet. "The 3rd drive," Kong said. "The location you haven't given us." "I'll retrieve it tonight," she said, "before we start." "Where is it?" She looked at him and then at Do Hyun. "I'll retrieve it tonight," she said again, with a specific inflection that meant, "This is the one thing I'm not giving the room." Kong looked at Do Hyun. Do Hyun looked at Nia for a moment and then nodded once, which meant, "Leave it." "Timing," Shin said from the wall. "Junho leaves the building at 11:15 usually." Conversation. After that, the window closes. Shin's expression didn't change. He pushed off the wall and left. Kong started working through the upload logistics with a technician who appeared from somewhere in the building's interior. Do Hyun stayed. When the room was as close to empty as it was going to get, he looked at her. "The 3rd drive." "I heard Kong." "I'm not asking the same question." He studied her face. "I'm asking if you're going somewhere alone tonight." She held his gaze. "I'll have my phone." "Phone. That's not Do Hyun." She said it quietly. 3 years. I've done this for 3 years. Let me do the one part I know how to do." The muscles in his jaw moved. He looked at the window, at the gray city outside. When he looked back, his expression had the quality of a man accepting a term he doesn't like because the alternative is worse. "You have 2 hours," he said. "If you're not back in 2 hours, I'm sending Shin. Shin will be occupied with Junho. Then I'm coming myself." She almost said something. Instead, she picked up her bag, checked that everything was where it should be, and walked out. The 3rd drive was in a safety deposit box at a private bank in Jongno that she'd opened under a name that was 1 generation removed from her current one. Not the name she'd run from Nairobi with, but the name before the name she used now, a layer down in the archaeology of who she'd been in the process of becoming someone survivable. She'd put it there 14 months ago, when Seoul had started to feel like somewhere she might stay long enough to need a deeper anchor. She got there at 9:10. The bank's after-hours service was slow, and the attendant took 4 minutes to process her access, during which she stood at the counter and watched the door, and thought about Junho sitting 3 floors below the Yoido building, working through whatever he was working through, not yet knowing that Shin was going to knock on his door in less than 2 hours. The drive was smaller than she remembered it being. That was always true of the things you built the most weight around. You opened the box and found something the size of your thumb. She put it in her interior jacket pocket and left. On the street, she stood for a moment in the cold and the noise of Jongno at 9 in the evening. The restaurant still going, The convenience stores lit up, people moving past her with the complete indifference of people who had somewhere specific to be. She stood in the middle of all of it and breathed and let herself have the 45 seconds of being a person on a street who was frightened and was acknowledging it, because she had learned a long time ago that the fear you refused to name was the fear that made the mistakes. She was frightened. The files were going to move tonight. After they moved, everything that had held Taijin's aggression in the specific shape of strategic pursuit would change, and she wasn't entirely sure what it would change into, and she had told Do-hyun she trusted her read of the man, and she did. But trusting your read and being certain you're right were different categories, and she'd learned that too. She started walking back toward Yoido. She didn't take a car, she needed the 20 minutes. She was 7 minutes into the walk when the black sedan pulled alongside her and stopped. The window came down. The man in the passenger seat was Reeves, the American. The man from the surveillance photograph, gray jacket, the one who had delivered Taejin's ultimatum 9 days ago. "Ms. Brooks," he said. He said it pleasantly, the way people say things when they have enough people with them that pleasantness is just aesthetics. "Mr. Han would like a word." She looked at the car. She looked at Reeves. She did not run, because running was how you gave someone your back, and she had learned not to give anyone her back. "He can call me," she said, and kept walking. The car moved with her. "That's not how he'd like to do it." "Then he's going to be disappointed." She pulled out her phone without looking at Reeves, typed a message to Do-hyun, "Jongno Daero, near the CGV. Reeves, come or send, now." "You're not afraid of us," Reeves said. There was something in his voice, not quite respect, something more provisional than that. Appraisal. "I'm in the middle of a busy street in Seoul at 9 o'clock at night," she said. "You're not going to do anything here." "Not here," he agreed, "but the night's long." "Yes, it is." She stopped walking and turned and faced the car fully. "Tell Taejin his filing deadline already passed, and that the people processing the paperwork work through the night." She held Reeves's gaze. "He'll know what that means." Something shifted in Reeves's face. It was small, but she caught it. The 2-second recalculation of a man receiving information he hadn't expected. "He'll want to speak with you directly before—" "Tell him," she said. She turned and kept walking. The car sat at the curb for a moment. Then it moved. Not toward her. Away, accelerating north. She watched it go and felt her heart rate at about 140, and deliberately did not think about what happened next. Just kept walking, kept her stride even, kept her face for anyone watching, like a woman going somewhere ordinary. Do-hyun's car arrived 4 minutes later. She got in. He was in the back seat, and he looked at her face, and then at the direction she'd come from, and then back at her. "Reeves," she said. "He knows, or he suspects. I told him the filings were moving." "You told him." "Tactical. If he reports back before we're positioned, Taejin will try to negotiate instead of deploy. It buys us maybe 40 minutes. She settled into the seat. "I have the drive." Do-hyun was looking at her in the way he'd looked at her twice before, the way that had no management in it, no performance. Just the full weight of paying attention to someone you can't afford to lose and are only beginning to understand you can't afford to lose. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "Your hands are shaking." She looked at them. They were, very slightly. She put them flat on her thighs. "Adrenaline. It passes." He didn't say anything. He reached over and put one of his hands over hers, flat and steady, and didn't move it, and she sat there with the city going past outside and the warmth of his hand on hers, and let the shaking subside without fighting it. It passed in about 90 seconds. She didn't move her hand. Neither did he. Shin knocked on Junho's door at 10:47. Nia watched the building's internal security feed from the technical room in Yoido. A grid of screens, the kind of setup that belonged to people who had long since decided that transparency was a liability. The angle wasn't perfect. She could see Junho's office door, the hallway, the edge of his desk through the glass partition. The conversation took 8 minutes. She couldn't hear it and didn't need to. She could read it in the architecture of the two men's bodies, the way Junho's shoulders rose and then went very still, the specific moment when Shin said whatever he said that moved the conversation from professional to something else, and the way Junho sat down without being asked to sit down. At 10:59, two of Shin's people entered the frame and Junho left the office between them, walking with the stiff, careful posture of a man trying to look like he was walking of his own accord. They went toward the elevator. He didn't look at the cameras. People who had been doing something wrong for a long time developed an allergy to cameras that was almost a tell on its own. Nia let out a breath. On the screen beside the one she'd been watching, Kong's technician was running through the upload preparation. 6 windows open, 6 destinations queued, the authentication sequences that would make the files verifiably unaltered running their last checks. "Ready," the technician said. She looked at Do-hyun, who was standing at her shoulder. He nodded. She looked at the screen. 6 years of Taijin's operations. Every transaction, every official, every hollow company that had moved money through 3 continents and left a trail, she'd had 20 minutes to copy and 3 years to protect. The files that had kept her alive by making her death a bad financial decision. After tonight, they would keep her alive by making her irrelevant to his calculations. That was the theory. "Do it," she said. The technician's hands moved. 6 progress bars appeared. The uploads began. The next 4 minutes were the quietest 4 minutes she had experienced in 3 years. Nobody spoke. The progress bars moved. Kong watched his phone, where notifications from their external contacts would arrive when the files landed. Do-hyun stood beside her and was entirely still, in the way he was still when he was holding something in. The first notification came at 11:14. Brussels. Then Nairobi, 11:16. Then the journalists, both within the same minute, flagged received and verified. The Financial Crimes Unit took until 11:21, which was 3 minutes longer than expected, and produced a specific quality of tension in the room that resolved when the notification arrived, and Kong let out a breath through his nose that was the closest thing to relief she'd seen from him. The last confirmation came at 11:23. The Regional Prosecutor's Office. 6 for 6. Nia pressed her fingers against the desk. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the numbers hadn't already said. "Now we wait," Kong said. "Now Do-hyun makes the call," she said. She looked at him. "It has to be now. Before Taejin's people confirm the uploads on their end, while he's still processing." Do-hyun looked at her steadily. "Are you sure about the messaging?" "Yes." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he picked up his phone and walked out of the technical room, and the door closed behind him, and Nia stood in front of the screens with the progress bars now all at 100% and waited for the next thing to happen. It came faster than she'd expected. 40 minutes after the uploads completed, Kong's phone produced 3 notifications in rapid succession. He read them, and his face did something complicated. "They're moving," he said to Taejin's people. 3 vehicles tracked from a location in Mapogu. They were already positioned. They were already staged here in the city. He looked up. "They're heading toward the Yoido building." Nia felt it go through her. Not surprised, not quite. Taejin was a strategist, and strategies had contingencies. He'd had people in position for the scenario where the files moved, which meant he'd wargamed this, which meant whatever was coming had been prepared for. "How long?" she said. 12 minutes. Maybe less with traffic. She turned to the door Do-hyun had walked through. She pushed it open. He was in the corridor, phone at his side, expression locked. "I heard," he said before she could speak. He didn't stand down. "No. He's running the revenge play." Her voice was level, but there was something under it that was working hard to stay under. "I was wrong." Do-hyun looked at her. "Or he's making a show before he stands down, demonstrating he had options. That's a generous read. It's a possible read." He was already moving, heading back toward the main floor. "Shin." Shin appeared from the stairwell like he'd been stationed there. Maybe he had been. "The building," Do-hyun said. "How are we positioned?" 6 on the ground floor, 2 at each entry. The parking structure has 4. Shin's voice was the same register it always was. Not calm, specifically, but occupying a frequency where urgency and calm were the same thing. "If they come with 3 vehicles, we're looking at 12 to 15 people maximum. They'll try the parking structure," Nia said. Both men looked at her. "It's what I would do. Garage access means controlled entry point, controlled exit, lower visibility from the street. If they're trying to take me rather than send a message, they want it contained." Shin looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun said, "Reinforce the structure. Pull 2 from each entrance." Shin moved. Do-hyun looked at Nia. You're not going to the garage. I wasn't planning to. You're going to the fourth floor. Kong stays with you. Do-hyun, this is not the thing I'm negotiating, he said. It was very quiet and very final. Every other thing tonight you've run. This one I'm running. Go to the fourth floor. She held his eyes for a beat. His face had the look of a man who has located the exact thing he is not prepared to compromise on. And the look was so unmanaged and so clear that it hit her somewhere she hadn't given anyone access to in 3 years. Don't get shot, she said. His expression shifted. Not a smile, something closer to the admission of one. Go. She went. The fourth floor was a conference room with windows that faced the street and a secondary room behind it with no windows at all. Kong steered her toward the secondary room without discussion, which she accepted, which told her something about the state of her own nerves that she chose not to examine too closely. She could hear things through the building, not clearly, the structure muffled too much. Doors. Voices at a register that wasn't conversation. At one point, something that might have been a vehicle in the parking structure below, and then a period of silence that was worse than the noise had been. Kong watched his phone. His face gave nothing away. She'd stopped asking him for updates 3 minutes in because the updates arrived when they arrived, and asking didn't accelerate them. She sat in the secondary room on a folding chair and put her hands flat on her knees and thought about the files. The 6 progress bars she'd watched move to completion, the 6 notifications, the 6 simultaneous cracks in the foundation of everything Tae-jin had built. By morning, there would be people in 3 countries reviewing what she'd sent. By the end of the week, there would be formal investigations. By the end of the month, if the content was what she knew it was, the first front company networks would start coming apart. She thought about that and held on to it, because the alternative was thinking about the sounds from below and what they meant. And that was a direction her mind didn't have clean access to right now. Kong's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Parking structure, he said. They came in hard. Shin's team is holding. Casualties? One of ours, minor. 3 of theirs, out of it. His phone buzzed again. He read it. 2 vehicles disabled. Third is, they're trying to breach the stairwell access from the structure. She stood up. Sit down, Kong said. What floor is the stairwell access? Ms. Brooks. What floor? Second. He looked at her steadily. Do-hyun is on the 2nd floor. Sit down. She sat down. She put her hands back on her knees and looked at the wall and breathed through her nose at a pace that was slightly slower than her body wanted, and slightly faster than she would have chosen. 3 minutes passed. 4. The sounds from below went through a phase that was concentrated and then a phase that was suddenly, completely absent. She didn't know which was worse. Kong's phone went again. He read the message and his face changed. The complicated thing again, like 2 opposing pieces of information arriving simultaneously. Stairwell breach was stopped, he said. One of Tae-jin's people got to the 2nd floor. Her throat closed. Do-hyun is... Kong paused, reading. He's standing. Minor injury. Another pause. The man from Tae-jin's team is detained. She let the breath out. She let it all the way out until there was nothing left, and then she breathed in again, and her hands were shaking again on her knees, and this time she didn't put them anywhere. She just let them shake. Minor injury, she said. Her voice came out strange. That's what it says. Define minor. It says minor. Kong looked at her with the expression of a man who would like to provide more precision, but has reached the limits of his information. He's moving. That's what I have. She nodded. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about what she'd said in the car on the way back from Jongno, that she trusted her read of Tae-jin, that he was a strategist who didn't spend resources on revenge. She'd been wrong, or she'd been right, and this was the demonstration before the stand-down, and she was sitting in a room on the 4th floor of a building in Yeouido, not knowing which one it was. And that was the specific texture of this particular fear, not the big formless terror of being hunted, but the concentrated, specific dread of not knowing if the one person who had said we and meant it was going to walk through the door. The door opened 9 minutes later. Do-hyun walked in. His jacket was gone. He had his left hand pressed against his right side, over his shirt, and the shirt had a dark patch on it that she identified before she could stop herself from identifying it. He was upright, and his eyes were clear, and he was moving without assistance. He looked at her. She crossed the room in about 4 steps and stopped directly in front of him and looked at his face and then at his side and then back at his face. How bad, she said. Knife, shallow. Shin's seen worse and so have I. His voice was even, controlled. But his face had dropped every layer of management it usually maintained, and what was underneath was tired and present and looking at her. She put her hand on his chest, flat, just to feel that he was there and upright, which was not a professional thing to do, and which she did anyway, and he covered her hand with his, the same gesture he'd made in the car, steady and deliberate. And they stood like that in the secondary conference room on the 4th floor of a building in Yowido, while Kong discreetly reorganized himself to face the other direction. The man who breached the stairwell, she said. Reeves? No, someone else. Reeves wasn't with this team. He paused. Which means Reeves is running the communication back to Taejin right now. Then we need the second part of your call, she said. The part where you make clear what happens if he tries this again. Do-hyun looked at her steadily. That part is ready. Do it now, while his operation in this building is finished and before he can regroup. I need 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes. She looked at his side. And then you need someone to look at that. After the call. Do-hyun. After the call, he said, with the same quality as before, the thing that was not negotiating. He looked at her hand still against his chest, and then at her. Stay here until I'm back. She wanted to say something difficult. Instead, I'll be here. He took his hand from hers and walked back out. She found out later what he said to Taejin. Not from Do-hyun directly, from Kong, who had monitored the call because monitoring calls was his function, and who gave her a summary the following morning in the sparse, factual language of someone reporting an event rather than rendering a judgment. Do-hyun had delivered 3 things. The first, confirmation that all 6 file deliveries had been authenticated and received, and that any attempt to suppress or dispute them would automatically trigger a 7th delivery to an additional recipient whose identity he did not disclose. The second, a specific accounting of every South Korean law enforcement and prosecutorial contact that the Cha organization could deploy against Taejin's remaining Korean-facing operations, which was a list long enough and detailed enough to communicate that the research had been done. The third was the simplest. 4 sentences. Kong quoted them with the neutral precision of a man reading from notes. You came to my city. You put your people in my building. You made a choice about what she was worth to you. Now I'm telling you what she's worth to me, and I want you to understand that those are 2 very different numbers. Then he had ended the call. Nia sat with that for a long time after Kong told her. She sat with it in the way you sit with something that has moved the furniture of your interior without asking, something you didn't plan for and can't categorize cleanly and can't put back to where it was. The response from Taejin's side came 4 hours later. Not a call, a message, relayed through a channel that Kong's people intercepted. 3 words. Routed through Reeves. Consider the matter closed. That was it. 3 words. The kind of concession that cost a man like Taejin more than anything that had happened in the parking structure, because it was the one written in legible language that left no room for reinterpretation. Consider the matter closed was not the language of a man planning a third approach. It was the language of a calculation that had run its full course and arrived at a number that didn't justify continuing. She read it twice on Kong's phone. She handed it back. It's over, Kong said. He said it like it was still surprising to him. This part of it, she said. The legal processes will take months. But the active threat is over, she said. Yes. She went to find Do-hyun. I was in the room adjacent to the technical floor, jacket still off, a man from the organization's medical staff finishing with the wound on his side. The knife had caught him along the lower ribs, shallow but long, the kind of injury that looked severe and produced a lot of blood, and was in fact less dangerous than it appeared, assuming the person who'd received it was otherwise intact. He was otherwise intact. He looked up when she came in. The medical staff finished and left. They were alone in the room. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at her with the expression that had no management in it, the one she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply recognizing. Kong told you, he said. Yes. 3 words. 3 words. She came into the room properly and sat in the chair the medical staff had been using, which put her close to him, which she had stopped pretending she didn't want. You didn't tell me what you were going to say to him. No. The last part. The part about the numbers. No. He held her gaze. Some things you don't script. She looked at him for a long moment. His face was tired in a way she recognized. Not the surface fatigue of a hard night, but the deep tired of someone who has been carrying something significant and has just set it down and is only now understanding how heavy it was. I was wrong, she said, about my read on him. He deployed anyway. Maybe. Do-hyun shifted carefully against the pain in his side. Or maybe the deployment was always part of his plan regardless. A demonstration that couldn't be called back once it started, regardless of what the files did. You couldn't have predicted the exact shape of it. I built my whole survival on predicting the exact shape of things. You survived, he said. 3 years, 4 countries, on your own. That's not a failed prediction. That's the score of someone who's been right enough times to still be here. He looked at her directly. Tonight you were still here? That counts. She looked at her hands in her lap. They'd stopped shaking. She couldn't remember exactly when. What you said, she started. About the numbers. What she's worth to you. She looked up. You didn't have to say it like that. I know. It changes things. I know, he said again. His voice was the quiet register, the one underneath everything else, the one she'd stopped being able to hear as simply dangerous and had started hearing as simply true. I said it because it was true, not because it was strategic. She held his gaze. The room was very still. The building had settled around them, the operational urgency draining out of it, the staff moving through their post-incident protocols, the city outside doing what the city always did, indifferent and enormous and lit up. She looked at Do-hyun, wounded and unmanaged, and looking back at her with the same attention he'd been paying her since the night in the car when she'd told him, "Yes, there's something you should know." And he'd said, "Not tonight, but tell me everything." She had told him everything. He'd said "we," and he'd meant it, and he'd taken a knife in the side over the distance between the second-floor stairwell and wherever he'd needed to be, and he'd made a phone call that had reduced 3 years of running to 3 words of closure. She reached over and put her hand against the side of his face. He went still. She felt the warmth of it, the specific texture of a person who was real and present and not performing anything. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "In the car," she said. "Last week. When you said you'd never admired someone so quickly." She held his gaze. "I felt it too. Whatever that was, I felt it." She paused. "I've been filing it for a month." He looked at her with something that was past admission, past the stripped-back honesty of the post-crisis room. "And now?" he said. She opened her mouth to answer, and that was the moment Kang knocked twice and opened the door and said there was a situation with one of the detained members of Tai Jin's team who was claiming diplomatic standing, and the lawyers needed guidance from Do-hyun before they could proceed. And the moment sealed itself and became a different kind of moment. The kind you carry instead of completing, the kind that stays with you through the rest of the night and into the early gray of morning, insisting on its own continuance. She lowered her hand. Do-hyun held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than Kang's interruption technically required, and then he looked at Kang and said, "Tell them to wait." He looked back at her. "Now," he said. "You were going to say something." She looked at him, at the tiredness and the realness and the total absence of performance, and she felt the 3 years of filing and managing and keeping herself exactly small enough to survive all press against the moment. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, the specific exhaustion of someone who no longer wants to be careful about this particular thing. "I was going to say," she said, "that I think I stopped running about 3 weeks ago, and I'm only figuring that out right now." The thing that crossed his face then was not a smile. It was something quieter and more permanent than a smile, something that had been waiting behind the controlled surface for long enough that when it finally arrived, it arrived without any performance at all. Outside, Seoul was doing what it always did. Lit up, indifferent, enormous, going in every direction at once. And inside this room on the 4th floor of a building in Yeouido, 2 people who had spent their separate years becoming very good at surviving sat with the specific, fragile, entirely unscripted weight of what came next. Kong waited exactly 4 seconds before he understood the room and pulled the door shut behind him. The lawyers could wait. Whatever diplomatic standing one of Tai Jin's detained men was claiming at that hour could wait. Everything beyond the walls of this particular room had been waiting for months, and 4 more minutes would not break anything that wasn't already broken. Kong was a man who had spent 2 decades reading situations for a living, and he read this one with the accuracy of someone who understood that some moments are not interruptions of the work. They are the work, the real kind, the kind that determines whether everything else was worth doing. Nia looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun looked at her. The statement she'd made sat between them with the weight of something carried too long to put down gracefully. I think I stopped running about 3 weeks ago, and I'm only figuring that out right now. And neither of them moved to diminish it with the wrong word or the wrong gesture, because both of them had learned, through entirely different educations, that the wrong word at the wrong moment could undo more than a wrong action ever could. 3 weeks ago, he said. He wasn't questioning. He was working out the math, placing it against the timeline of what he remembered. The gallery, she said, when you pulled me away from Dongwook. She looked at her hands, then made herself stop looking at them. I told myself it was operational, that you were protecting an asset in a public space. I believed it long enough to get through the car ride home. And after the car ride? After the car ride, I sat in my apartment and argued with myself for 2 hours and lost. She looked up at him. I'm not used to losing those arguments. I know. He said it without satisfaction. I've been losing the same argument since approximately the same night. He shifted, and the movement cost him something. She saw it in the tightening around his eyes, the wound making itself known. And she didn't say anything about it because he would have told her it was fine, which would have been mostly true and entirely not the point. I kept reframing it, telling myself it was the situation, the intensity of the circumstances, the way high-pressure environments manufacture false intimacy. Did you believe that? For about a week. And then? And then you sent Junho's projections back with a correction note that was 3 sentences long and completely right, and I realized the problem wasn't the circumstances. He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to name, the one that was past every operational layer, just the face underneath all of it, tired and present and paying attention. The problem was that I had been looking for a reason to be wrong about you, and I kept failing to find one. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the building, voices moved through a corridor and faded. The city beyond the windows was doing its usual thing, indifferent, lit, enormous, unconcerned with anything happening on the 4th floor. I'm not easy, she said. She needed to say it here, in this room, before anything else. I want you to understand that going in, not figure it out later. I don't know how to let people make decisions for me without pushing back. I've spent 3 years building exits into everything. Apartments, contracts, relationships, every room I walk into. That doesn't switch off because the threat does. She held his gaze. And I was with a man who looked at me and saw something to contain, something to make smaller. I spent 8 months getting smaller, and I am categorically not doing that again. I know, he said. Knowing and living with it are different. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I've spent my adult life being told I look at people like problems I'm managing, that I optimize instead of feel, that I make everyone around me feel surveilled. He paused. Most of that is accurate. What I'm telling you is that I'm aware of it, which doesn't fix it, but at least means we're not starting from nothing. She looked at him. The man who had put surveillance on her building without telling her. The man who had made the call to Tae-jin without a script. The man who had said what she's worth to me in 4 sentences to a criminal on the other end of a phone at 1 in the morning and had not mentioned it to her until Kang summarized it the following day. The man who had put his hand over hers in the car when she was shaking and had not said a single word about it. Imperfect, entirely imperfect, in specific and mappable ways. We're not starting from nothing, she agreed. She leaned forward and kissed him. Not the staged kind, not the calibrated performances at galas and client dinners, the practiced touches designed for audiences who needed to believe something. This was the other kind, the kind that had no audience and no purpose outside itself, and it had the texture of something that had been waiting long enough to have developed patience and was now done waiting. His hand came up to the side of her face, careful around her still tender cheekbone, and she felt the deliberateness of that carefulness, the specific attention of it. and her hand found the back of his neck, and they stayed there in the quiet room on the fourth floor with the city going on around them and did not perform anything for anyone. When they separated, his forehead came to rest against hers. She could feel him breathing, the rhythm of it, slightly uneven from the wound, from the night, from whatever this was. "You need a hospital," she said. Her voice was different than it had been before, softer in a way she usually controlled. "Tomorrow." "Do-hyun." "I know." He pulled back enough to look at her. "Tomorrow, first thing." She looked at his side, at the dark patch on his shirt that had stopped spreading but was still there. She thought about the stairwell and the 12 minutes she'd spent on the fourth floor not knowing. She thought about the specific texture of those 12 minutes, how time had moved differently inside them, and what that told her about what she'd already decided before she'd consciously decided it. "Okay," she said. "Tomorrow." He almost smiled, the particular almost smile that understood itself. "Stay in the building tonight." "I was already going to." "I know." He stood carefully, and she stood with him, and she steadied him once with her hand at his arm, and he accepted it without comment, which was, she thought, a kind of progress in itself. A man who had spent years making himself unsteadyable, accepting steadying. The hospital was a private facility in Gangnam that Do-hyun's organization used for situations requiring discretion. They arrived at 8 in the morning, and the wound was properly cleaned and assessed. 6 centimeters, shallow depth, no structural damage, requiring closure, and a course of antibiotics and a warning about exertion that the attending physician delivered with the specific resignation of someone who has given the same warning to the same type of man before and expects similar compliance. Do-hyun listened to the warning. He did not promise anything. Nia sat in the adjacent room during the procedure and looked at her phone and processed the night in the particular way she processed difficult things. Not by thinking about them directly, but by letting them exist in her peripheral awareness while she focused on something else. She answered 3 work emails. She reviewed a contract clause Adias had sent from London. She noted, with the detached precision of someone conducting an internal inventory, that her hands were not shaking. They had stopped shaking sometime around 2 in the morning, when she'd finally slept for 3 hours on the cot in the room they'd given her, and she'd woken up with the specific clarity of someone who has come through something and is still on the other side of it. When Do-hyun came out of the procedure room with his side properly dressed and a prescription in his hand and the attending physician's resignation still visible in the set of his mouth, he looked at her in the waiting area and said, "You look like you slept." 3 hours, she said. "You?" "Less." He sat down beside her slowly and looked at the prescription. "Kong wants a debrief at 11. Then we have time for breakfast." He looked at her. "Breakfast? You haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Neither have I." She stood and picked up her bag. "There's a place 2 blocks from here that opens at 8:30. I passed it on the way in." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was not quite surprise and was something more specific. The look of a man recalibrating around a small, ordinary kindness that he hadn't expected and didn't know the category for. Okay, he said. He stood. They went to breakfast. It was a small place with 4 tables and a woman behind the counter who gave them both the comprehensive assessing look of someone who has seen all manner of people come through her door and has formed opinions about all of them within 30 seconds. She brought them doenjang gai and rice without being asked, which suggested she had decided what they needed regardless of what they might have ordered. She was right. It was exactly what they needed. They ate mostly without talking, which was a different quality of silence than the silences they'd occupied before. Not the weighted professional silences of the office, not the high-pressure silences of the Yoido building. Something simpler. The silence of 2 people eating breakfast after a hard night who have arrived at a point where the silence doesn't require management. At some point, Do-hyun said, "The thing I said to him, about the numbers." She looked up. "Kong told you," he said. Wasn't a question. "Yes." "I didn't plan it in those words." He looked at his food. "I had a framework for the call, the files, the legal exposure, the specific operational consequences. The last part came out different than I'd prepared." "I know." She held his gaze when he looked up. "That's why it worked." He nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else and then didn't, and she understood that he had arrived at the limit of what he could articulate about it. which was fine. Some things didn't require articulation. They had already been said in 4 sentences to a man on the other end of a phone at 1 in the morning, and that was enough. The debrief with Kong was thorough and took 2 hours instead of 1. There were 7 people in the Yowido conference room. Kong, 2 members of his intelligence staff, Shin, the organization's legal counsel, and a representative from the external law firm that handled the Cha organization's more complicated situations. Nia sat at the table as herself, not as Do-hyun's executive assistant, not as his fake fiancé, not as a resource to be protected or an asset to be managed. As the person who had provided the files that had initiated 3 international investigations and who had consequential knowledge of the events of the preceding 12 hours. They went through it systematically. The timeline of the breaches, Junho, Yumin Jae, the schedule data, the parking structure attack. The detained members of Taijin's team, 2 of whom were asserting diplomatic connections that the legal team was in the process of verifying and which they expected to be partially valid and entirely insufficient to prevent deportation. The 3-word message and what it meant legally and operationally. At one point, the external lawyer, a precise woman in her 50s named Baek, who had the energy of someone who had seen worse than this and knew it, but did not find the knowing comfortable, said to Nia directly, "The files you provided, the authentication chain, can you walk us through the provenance of each document?" Nia walked her through it. 20 minutes, 6 document categories, the encryption protocol she'd used, the chain of custody from the night she'd copied them to the 6 simultaneous deliveries the previous evening. She spoke in the flat, organized language of someone providing legal testimony, and when she finished, Baek looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite respect because Baek did not perform respect, and said, "You maintained that chain of custody for 3 years while operating under a modified identity in a foreign country." "Yes, without legal counsel. I couldn't afford the exposure that came with legal counsel." Beck nodded once, in the specific way of someone filing the answer. "You'll need formal representation for the ongoing proceedings. The Nairobi prosecutor's office will want direct contact, and the Brussels regulatory body will require a deposition." "I have representation," Nia said, "London-based. I'll send the contact information." Beck looked at her for another moment. "All right," she said, and returned to her notes. Across the table, Do-hyun was watching this exchange with an expression that she caught from the corner of her eye and chose not to look at directly. The expression that was the particular quality of someone watching a person they care about demonstrate exactly who they are in a room full of people who are still figuring it out. The weeks that followed had the texture of aftermath, not peaceful, not resolved, but different in quality from what had come before. The acute danger had changed shape into chronic legal complexity, which was a better problem. Chronic legal complexity was a problem with timetables and documentation requirements and conference calls with ADs in London, which was a problem Nia was equipped for. The first wave arrived immediately. The investigators needed her, not in person, not yet, but in secured communication, with access to the files, with her ability to provide context for documents that were technically legible but operationally opaque without the knowledge of how Taejin's networks actually functioned. She spent 4 mornings in the first 2 weeks in a Yowido conference room with an encrypted connection, walking investigators through the architecture of what she'd given them. It was worse than the original copying had been. Copying had been terror, pure and simple. 20 minutes of adrenaline and the click of a drive being pulled from a port. This was different. This required her to hold the memories steady and examine them at length. Every operational detail she'd observed in 8 months of proximity to Taejin's world. Every conversation she'd half overheard and had filed away because filing things was how she survived. Every moment she had understood what she was adjacent to and had made the calculation to stay long enough to get what she needed to get out safely. The 4th morning, after a 2-hour session that had ended with an investigator in Nairobi thanking her for her clarity, she sat in the conference room after everyone else had left and looked at the table for a while. Do-hyun found her there 20 minutes later. He didn't ask. He sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her and waited. She picked up the coffee. She drank some of it. She looked at the table. "I was in love with him," she said. "When it started. I want you to know that because I've been telling the story of those 8 months in the language of strategy, files and evidence and survival decisions. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth." She looked up. "I was in love with him, And then I understood what he was, and those two things existed at the same time for a while. And that was the hardest part. Not the fear. The grief. Do-hyun held her gaze. He did not fill the space with reassurance. He let her finish. I copied the files, she said, partly because they were the only leverage I had and I knew I was going to need leverage, and partly because I was furious. At him, at myself, at the 8 months I'd spent making myself smaller and calling it love. She set down her coffee. I was 28 years old, and I thought the intensity of being wanted by someone dangerous was the same thing as being truly seen. And then I understood it wasn't, and I ran, and I spent 3 years outrunning both the danger and the grief simultaneously. She paused. I'm tired of that. I want to be somewhere where the grief can just be the grief, without the running attached to it. Do-hyun looked at her across the table. He said, "It can be." She nodded. She believed him. That was the thing she was still getting used to, the experience of believing someone without the backup calculations running underneath. I'm not going to ask you to compete with a ghost, she said. That's not what this is. I know what this is, he said, and I know what it isn't. She looked at him. He had the tiredness of someone who was also moving through aftermath, the internal audit of his own organization, the conversations with staff who had worked alongside a man for a decade and were now understanding they hadn't known him, the reorientation required when someone you trusted turns out to have been oriented elsewhere. Neither of them was arriving at this clean. We're both a mess, she said. We're both functional, he said. That's not the same as a mess. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter than a laugh, but warmer than anything else, and he looked at it on her face with the expression she'd stopped trying to name. And they sat in the conference room drinking bad coffee in the aftermath of everything, which was not what either of them would have designed, but was, she thought, exactly correct. Park Joon-ho was relocated to a regional position in Busan within the month. The announcement was made internally with the language of organizational restructuring, which was the language these things required, and most of the staff received it with the careful neutrality of people who understood that the full story existed and that their role was not to request it. 2 members of the staff asked to speak with Do-hyun privately in the days following. Shin reported this to Nia without being asked to, which told her that Shin had decided she was a relevant party to the operational health of the organization, which was its own form of recognition from a man who communicated primarily through action and omission. She spoke with both staff members herself, at Do-hyun's suggestion, which she'd initially questioned and then understood. He was signaling to his own organization that she was not an external event that had passed, but a presence with continuity. She handled both conversations the way she handled difficult things, directly, without excess comfort, but with the specific attention of someone who understood that being told your colleague was selling your information is a different kind of betrayal than being told your colleague was dishonest, and that the difference requires acknowledgement. After the second conversation, she sat in her office and looked at the desk she'd occupied for what was now approaching 5 months, and thought about the fact that it was not, and had never been, entirely her desk. It was the desk of a position she'd taken under circumstances that had since transformed entirely, and she was still doing the work of that position, and the work was good and she was good at it, and she was also, she understood, done with it. The knowing arrived without announcement. It was simply there one morning, the way the important knowings arrive. Not as a decision, but as the recognition of something that has already been decided by some part of you that works in advance of your conscious attention. She was done with this version of the work. It had served her and she had served it, and the honest next step was something else. She did not tell Do-hyun immediately. She sat with it for 4 days, which was the appropriate amount of time to make sure the knowing was a knowing and not a reaction to the difficulty of the preceding weeks. On the 5th day, she was still certain, and on the 6th, she wrote the letter. She resigned on a Tuesday morning. She brought the letter in paper form, which was a choice. The officialness of paper, the commitment of ink, the fact that it required him to receive something tangible rather than read something on a screen. He read it at his desk while she stood. He set it down and looked at the window, which he did when he was processing something he hadn't fully prepared for, and she gave him the time of the window. When he looked back, his face had the quality she'd seen in the 4th floor room. No management, just the person underneath it. The consulting position, he said. Yes. She told him about the Singapore firm, the Seoul office, the Mekong Basin project. She told him the timeline and the start date. She told him what the work was and why it suited her, not because he needed to approve any of it, but because he deserved the full information. He listened without interrupting, which he was better at than most people in his position. When she finished, he said, "You built a career out of nothing. 3 years, 4 countries, modified identity, legal exposure, and active threat. And you built a career." "I built a hiding place," she said. "That's different." She looked at him steadily. "This is the career." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. And then, after a pause that had weight in it, "I'm going to miss the work." "The work," she said, "and you in the building." He said it plainly, without softening it or overdressing it. Those are two separate things, and both of them are true. She felt it land in the specific place where the true things landed. "I'm not going anywhere else," she said. "I'm going somewhere new. There's a difference." "Yes." He looked at the letter on his desk. "I'll need you for the transition. 2 weeks at minimum." "3," she said. "I told them 3." "3." He nodded. He looked at her with the expression that was past the almost smile. "The Daegu deal closes before you leave." "I know. I'll be there." "Good." He picked up the letter and placed it in his action folder, the real administrative processing of it, which was the right response, and which she noted as the right response, and felt the particular warmth of being with someone who could locate the right response, even when the right response required him to receive something he didn't want. "The Yoon group wants a dinner before the close. Byung-chul asked about you specifically." "I'll be there." "After that," he said, "you work for yourself." She looked at him across the desk in the low light of the office, the same desk and the same light and the same city visible through the same windows as the morning she'd refused to sit down and said she'd leave if it went badly. Everything structural was the same. Everything else had changed completely. "After that," she agreed. The Daegu deal closed on a Tuesday in a conference room in Junggu with 7 people at the table and numbers that told the accurate story because the model was correct now. Nia signed 2 documents and shook 4 hands and ate the lunch afterward with the fluency of someone who had learned the grammar of this world from the inside, who could read a room of businessmen through the quality of their handshakes and the way they positioned themselves relative to the door. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, even when she thought she was only pretending to be. Yoon Jae-won found her near the end of the lunch when the table had become less formal and people were standing in small clusters with coffee. He was the youngest person in the room and had been careful about it all day, which she'd noted and respected. "The depreciation correction," he said. "I studied the final model. You were right about years 4 and 5. "I know," she said. He looked startled for a half second and then laughed. Genuine, unguarded. "You always just say that." "When I'm right." She looked at him. "It saves time. And it's more honest than the alternative, which is pretending I'm surprised to be right when I'm not." He considered this with the seriousness of someone storing it. Then, "My father says you're leaving. At the end of the week. He's sorry to lose you." Chaewon glanced across the room to where Byung-chul was talking with Do-hyun, the 2 older men in the particular proximity of people who have been doing business together long enough to have developed a kind of trust that is not friendship but is not nothing. He's also trying to figure out how to make an offer without offending anyone. "Tell him he can make the offer," she said. "I won't be offended. I'll be placed, but I won't be offended." Chaewon nodded. He looked at Do-hyun across the room and then at her, with the frank curiosity of someone young enough to still look directly at the thing he's curious about. "He's different with you," he said. "Do-hyun. Different than I've seen him before." She followed his gaze across the room. Do-hyun was listening to something Byung-chul was saying, and in the quality of his listening, unhurried, genuinely present, she could see the difference Jae-won was describing, could see it clearly from the outside, the way she couldn't always see it from inside the proximity of it. "Different how?" she said, though she thought she knew. "Less contained," Jae-won said. He seemed to realize this might be more than he should say, and then decided he'd already said it and committed. Like he's not spending energy holding himself together. She looked at Do-hyun across the room. He glanced over at that moment, the way he sometimes did, a frequency she'd stopped attributing to coincidence, and held her gaze for 2 seconds before returning to Byung-chul. "Yeah," she said. "I see that." The Yoon Group dinner was at a restaurant in Hanam-dong, smaller and quieter than the first one, the kind of venue that demonstrated confidence without effort. She wore the dark green dress she'd almost returned twice and had stopped almost returning. At some point during the meal, Byung-chul made the offer. He did it gracefully, framed as a hypothetical partnership inquiry, which gave everyone room to respond without commitment. Nia thanked him genuinely, told him she was placed, and said she'd keep the Yoon Group in mind for future project intersections, which was true and which Byung-chul received with the nod of a man who understands a real answer when he hears one. Afterward, in the car, Do-hyun said, "Byung-chul likes you." "I know. He's been in business for 40 years and I've never heard him make a direct offer to someone he'd met 3 times. I'm flattered." She looked out the window. The city was doing its late-night thing, thinner traffic, the lights more visible without the day's blur of activity around them. "I'm also placed." "I know." A pause. "You made the right choice." "I know that too." He looked at her with the expression, and she looked back at him, and the car moved through the quiet streets, and it was not so different from the first car ride months ago. Same city, same dark, the privacy screen up, except that everything about what existed between them now was different, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. Her last official day was a Friday. She cleared her desk in the morning, which took less time than she'd expected because she'd never accumulated the volume of personal objects that people accumulate when they're certain of permanence. A few notebooks. A small succulent she'd bought at a street market months ago that had survived, which she took as information about its character. A legal pad with notes from the Daegu model correction that she kept, because it was the record of the moment she'd decided to stay and fight for the right number rather than let the wrong one stand. Shin came to her office in the early afternoon. He knocked, which he didn't always do, and stood in the doorway with the expression that was as close to something as his face got. "You're leaving at 5, he said. "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the cleared desk. He said, "You made it easier." She looked at him. "The job?" "The job." A pause. "The building, the last 3 months." He seemed to arrive at the limit of what he was going to say and stood with it for a moment. "You made it easier." She understood he was not talking about logistics. "Thank you, Shin." He nodded once. He left. She looked at the doorway after he was gone and thought about the coffee he'd placed on her desk every morning without being asked, the way he'd left the surveillance summary on the corner without explanation because he'd decided she was a relevant party before anyone had formally decided she was. The way he had said she's not in the building when Do-hyun had asked on the night in the parking structure, and the specific quality of those 4 words in the context of what was happening around them. There were people in this building who had decided she was worth something, one by one, in the accumulation of small decisions that adds up to belonging. She had not been looking for that. She had arrived looking for money and safety and somewhere to wait out the worst of what was coming. She was leaving with considerably more than she'd budgeted for. At 5 o'clock, she walked out of the building. She did not look back, which was not a symbolic choice. She had somewhere to be, and she was already going. Do-hyun called her on a Saturday 2 weeks into her new position, in the morning, when she was at her desk in the Seong-Sudong office with a financial analysis open on her laptop and coffee that was bad in a different way than the office coffee had been bad. "Are you busy tonight?" he said. She looked at the analysis. It could wait until Sunday. "Define busy." "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Not a restaurant, not an event. Somewhere I actually want to be." She looked at her coffee. She looked at the succulent on the corner of her desk that had survived the move from one office to another, which she continued to find informative about its character. "Give me an hour," she said. He picked her up at 7. He was wearing a dark jacket over a plain shirt, no tie, which she'd rarely seen, and he looked like himself in the particular way he looked like himself when no audience was present. Not the version that occupied conference rooms, but the underneath version, the one she'd first encountered in a 4th-floor room at 2 in the morning with no jacket and no performance. "Where are we going?" she said in the car. "Gwangjang Market." She looked at him. "The night market." "You've never been." "I haven't." She waited. "I went when I was 12, he said. He was looking out the window at the city moving past. "With my mother." He said it in the way he said things he didn't say often, flat, factual, without announcing the weight of it. She liked the bindetiok, the mung bean pancakes. She used to say they were the most honest food in Seoul because there was nothing decorative about them. What you saw was the whole thing. Nia was quiet for a moment. How long has it been since you were there? Since she died. He looked at the window. 14 was the last time. She looked at his profile in the light coming through the glass, the jaw that was usually set and was now, in the context of this conversation, simply the face of a man carrying a loss he'd carried for 24 years, weight redistributed into the architecture of how he moved through the world, present in everything if you knew where to look. She would have liked you, he said. He said it with the certainty of someone stating a fact they've thought about enough to be sure of. She didn't like people who flinched either. Nia felt the warmth of it. Not sentiment, something more solid than sentiment. The specific warmth of being placed in the context of someone's most important things. She sounds like someone who saw clearly, she said. She saw everything. He turned from the window. She also would have told me within about 30 seconds that I'd been in love with you for months, and that I was being a fool about it. She would have been right, Nia said. She usually was. Something crossed his face, grief and humor occupying the same space, which is where they live in people who have had enough time to let them coexist. She was also right about the pancakes. Gwangjang Market at night was everything the controlled, formal world of the previous months was not. The noise arrived before they were through the entrance, vendor calls and sizzling oil, and the compressed human energy of a space that had been doing this for 100 years and intended to keep doing it. The smell was sesame and frying batter and something sweet underneath all of it. People moved in every direction without apology, and the light was the warm, undesigned light of a place that had not been lit by anyone with intentions about atmosphere. Do-hyun moved through it differently than he moved through every other space she'd watched him move through. The quality of his presence shifted, not smaller, but permissive. He let the crowd nudge him slightly off his chosen line. He stopped at a counter without calculating which one was optimal and pointed at the bindetiok and held up 2 fingers. They found stools at a long counter and the food arrived fast, the way food arrives in places that have been serving people for generations and know that efficiency is a form of respect. She ate the mung bean pancake with the full attention it deserved, crispy at the edges, dense in the center, honest in exactly the way he'd described. She was right, Nia said. Yes. He was watching her eat with the expression she'd stopped naming. You look different here. Different how? She took another piece. Like someone who doesn't have an exit strategy. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression that had no management in it, and in the market light it had a quality she'd never seen from it before. Something almost young, the way faces look when the thing they've been holding has finally been set somewhere safe. I probably still have one, she said. Somewhere in the back. It's a habit. I know. He looked at his food. I have one too. Different kind. The kind where you make yourself so necessary to the operation that leaving becomes impossible. She looked at him. You make yourself indispensable so you can't be abandoned. He looked up. Yes. He said it without embarrassment, which was the quality of someone who has already examined the thing enough to state it plainly. It's the same instinct, different direction. She held his gaze across the narrow counter. We're a mess, she said. We're functional, he said, same as before. Still not the same thing. She ordered the noodle dish she hadn't known the name of before. It arrived and she ate it, and it was irregular in the way that handmade things are irregular, and it was very good. Around them the market moved and was indifferent and enormous and accommodating all at once, the way places that have been existing for a long time develop a kind of spaciousness for human variety. At some point she looked at him and said, I love you. She said it the way she'd decided to say things that mattered, without the elaborate infrastructure she used to build around important things to protect them from the open air. Just out loud, across a counter, in a market, to a man who had driven her away from a kidnapping attempt and taken a knife in the side and said what she's worth to me, to a criminal on the phone and made her coffee appear by way of someone else every morning for 5 months without ever acknowledging it. He looked at her. The thing that moved through his face was not small and was not performed, and arrived with the quality of something that had been waiting long enough to have become patient, and was now done being patient. I know, he said. Then, I've known for longer than you have. She looked at him steadily. How long? The gallery. He held her gaze. When you slapped her back twice and went and ordered water, and your hand was shaking slightly where you thought no one was looking. He paused. I was looking. She thought about that night. The sting, the 2 seconds of adrenaline she'd been furious at herself for, the glass of water, and the effort of her hand being still. She had thought she was alone in that moment. She had not been. You saw that, she said. I see most things, he said. That one I was looking for. He looked at the counter, at the plate between them. You kept going, after the shaking. You went back into the room and worked it for another 3 hours, and your hand never shook again all night. He looked up. That was when I knew. She was quiet for a moment. The market went on around them. All the noise and light and human persistence of a place that had survived everything that had happened in and around it for 100 years and intended to survive considerably more. I'm sorry it took me so long, she said. You arrived exactly when you needed to. He picked up the last piece of bindeetioque from the plate. My mother would have said you can't rush someone home. She felt that land in the specific place where the true things landed. She didn't say anything for a moment. She let it be what it was. She sounds like someone who knew a great deal, she said finally. She knew everything that mattered. He looked at the empty plate. She knew the honest food from the decorated kind. She knew the people who stayed from the ones who were passing through. He looked at her. She would have known you in about 30 seconds. What would she have said? He considered this with the care of someone who takes the question seriously. She would have said, this one is tired of running and doesn't know it yet. He held her gaze. And then she would have made you eat something. Nia looked at him across the counter in the market light, in the noise and the warmth of the place, and thought about her mother and his mother, and the distance between Nairobi and Brussels and Seoul, and the encrypted drives and the second-hand blazer, and the 11 rehearsals of a name she'd borrowed from necessity. She thought about 20 minutes in an office in Nairobi and 3 years of motion, and one morning in a 62nd floor office when she'd refused to sit down. She thought about all of it and understood. Sitting in this market with this man in this city she had chosen without planning to choose it. That the line between those things and this moment was not a line of escape. It was a line of arrival. She had been moving toward this. Not because it was planned, not because she had navigated correctly at every turn. She had made mistakes. She had been wrong about Tae-jin's response. She had filed things that needed to be said and kept exits in rooms that didn't require them. She was not a clean story of correct decisions. She was a person who had survived imperfectly and arrived somewhere real. That was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. Do-hyun paid for the food. She let him, which was different from the month before, when she would have argued it, and which she noted as information about herself without judgment. They walked out of the market into the cooler air of the city, and Seoul rearranged itself around them in every direction, lit and enormous and entirely unconcerned with what had just happened inside it. She took his hand, not because there was an audience, not because it served a purpose, because it was there and she wanted to, which had always been the only 2 reasons that were the right reasons. He held it. They walked north along the river, the Han wide and dark and moving beside them, the bridges lit against the sky, the city on both banks doing its ordinary late-night business. They did not talk much. When they did, it was in the easy, incomplete way of people who don't need to fill silence with content. He pointed out a building he'd worked on in some capacity years ago. She told him a story about the first contract she'd done in Seoul that had gone wrong in a way that was almost funny in retrospect. And he listened with the specific quality of someone who is genuinely interested and not performing interest. At some point, they stopped at the railing above the water and stood there without particular intention. The river moved. A boat was lit up somewhere on the far bank. The air smelled of the city and the water and the specific season they were in, fall pressing into the edges of things. She leaned against his shoulder. He adjusted his arm so she was more comfortably against him, which cost him something with the healing wound and which he did without mentioning, and she let him do it, which was its own kind of trust, the small kind, the daily kind, the kind that builds the actual structure of things. 3 months ago, she said, I had a bag packed in a locker at Susio Station and a contact number in Osaka. I know. He felt her look up at him. Kong told me, early on. And you didn't say anything. It wasn't mine to say anything about. He looked at the river. It was yours to stop needing. She looked at the water for a long time. The bag was still there. She hadn't retrieved it, hadn't renewed the locker. She'd thought about it twice, and both times had let the thought pass without acting on it, which was the closest she'd come to a deliberate decision about it. At some point, the locker period would lapse and someone would clear it, and the bag would be gone. And she'd have made the choice not through action, but through the specific courage of inaction, the courage of not maintaining an exit. She thought she might be approaching that. She wasn't entirely there, and she wasn't going to perform being entirely there. But she was approaching it. "I'm still working on it," she said. "I know." His arm was around her and his voice was even, and there was no pressure in it, no destination it was trying to arrive at. "Take the time it takes." She stood by the river in the city she had chosen, leaning against a man who had said "we" and kept saying it, and let the sound of the water do what water has always done for people with too much in their heads. Not resolve anything, not erase anything, just provide a steady reference point against which the human noise becomes more navigable. The investigation into Taejin's network would take 2 more years to reach their fullest consequence. There would be depositions and documented testimonies, and the particular exhaustion of being involved in a legal process at international scale. Adaez would become a permanent fixture in her professional life, a relationship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that careful people do better work. The front company networks would come apart in stages, publicly, in the financial news that Nia would read with the detached attention of someone who had provided the material and was now watching it do its work at a distance. Taejin would not contact her again. 3 words, "consider the matter closed," turned out to be what they claimed to be. Not because he had become a different man, but because the calculation had produced a definitive number and he had accepted the number with the cold practicality of someone for whom everything was always arithmetic. She would hear about him occasionally, through Adaeze, through the legal processes, his lawyers fighting, his operations contracting, his networks losing their shape. She did not feel satisfaction about this. Exactly. She felt something closer to the completion of an obligation, 3 years of carrying the weight of what she'd seen, and now the weight was where it was supposed to be, held by institutions built for that purpose. Junho would leave the Cha organization entirely within 6 months, in a manner that was described as mutual, and which was the correct description in the technical sense. She heard about this from Do Hyun in the straightforward way he told her things she should know, without drama or emphasis. She received it the same way. Shin would remain. He would continue to leave coffee on surfaces where it would be useful to people who hadn't asked for it, which was his form of communication, and which she would come to understand was also, in its way, his form of affection, not demonstrated in words or gestures that required reciprocation, but in the steady, reliable presence of having thought about what someone needed before they knew they needed it. She would be good at the consulting work, not the performing goodness kind of good, the actual kind, the kind built from years of doing the real thing under the worst conditions, which turned out to be better preparation than the alternative. She would have difficult clients and successful projects, and the specific satisfaction of work that was entirely her own, accountable to her own standard, measured against no one else's expectations of what she should be doing. She would keep her apartment. She would keep the succulent that had survived 2 offices, and it turned out a move to a 3rd. She would keep the legal pad from the Daegu model correction because it was the record of the moment she'd decided to stay and fight for the right number, and some records were worth keeping. 4 or 5 nights a week she would be somewhere else, which was an arrangement that had found its rhythm without being designed, and which felt, in its irregularity, its lack of performance, its comfortable incompleteness, more honest than anything formal would have. She was not the person who had walked into a 62nd floor office in a second-hand blazer rehearsing her name. She was continuous with that person, built from her, bearing her marks, carrying her hard-won knowledge, but not limited to her. The woman who had made herself smaller for 8 months, and the woman who had copied 20 minutes of files and run, and the woman who had stood in the middle of a charity gala and slapped back twice and ordered water and gone back to work. All of those women were here, in this person standing by this river, with this man, in this city. She had not escaped them, she had incorporated them. She was larger than the running had required her to be, and she was still figuring out what to do with all that space, and she had the specific luxury now, the one she hadn't had in 3 years, of figuring it out without urgency. The river moved beside them. The city held its ordinary breath. She tightened her hand in his, slightly, without looking up. He tightened back. They stood there until the cold came up off the water and gave them a reason to start walking again. And then they walked, and Seoul went with them in every direction, lit and enormous and entirely indifferent, the way cities are, the way the best cities are, the ones that survive everything and keep going, that absorb the full weight of human experience without making it about themselves, that hold space for all of it, the grief and the relief and the love and the ordinary courage of two people choosing, for no reason the city could understand and no reason that required understanding, to go in the same direction, together, toward whatever came next.